Where will the top NFL free agents land this off season? Welcome, football fans, to another BR live stream. And in this live, it's never too early to talk NFL free agency. Why? Because free agency is my favorite part of the NFL offseason, even more than the draft. So in this live stream, we are going to determine where the top names, the top 7 names, I tried to spread it across different positions, offensively, defensively, spread the wealth across different needy teams for needy free agents. And how this goes when I think about free agent landing spots is I think about the 2 F's, fit and financials. Does a team have the space to make it happen from a cap perspective? Who has the most money to throw out there and make their team better? And then the fit, the scheme, the attachment to a coach or some player. I always look for the ties between and the connections between a player and a potential destination. So with that being said, let me know in the comments what you guys think about these potential fits. And let me know if I'm right, I'm wrong, if you think a different team would be a little bit better. Always open to hear from you guys in the chat. Let's have some fun. Okay, let's start it off with the first free agent. Of course, the biggest name in free agency at the most important position is a man that's had a breakout season, Sam Darnold. The destination for Sam Darnold that I believe makes the most sense is the Las Vegas Raiders. Now, let's break down why the Raiders are the perfect fit for Sam Darnold. Now, first, you have to think about where the Raiders pick in the draft. The Raiders pick 6th. So in order for them to get one of the top 2 quarterbacks in the draft, they'll likely have to have a third top 3, right, pick in the draft. I don't see that happening unless they mortgage their future to get a young quarterback. But the thing about Sam Darnold is he's only 27. He's coming off a breakout season. And if you think about how the Raiders are currently constructing their team, it's going to be Tom Brady influenced. Tom Brady has already made a decision, booting out the general manager. They're trying to find that new head coach. And what if the new head coach is a Tom Brady Patriot type of guy like Brian Flores, who is currently the Vikings defensive coordinator? I'm just throwing that out there. Even if it's somebody like Mike Vrabel, think about that possibility as well. Okay, so Darnold makes sense, especially if it's Flores, because he might even bring in an offensive Viking type of guy to run the offensive side of the football. So Darnold will already have familiarity there. Now, could Darnold stick around with the Vikings? That is entirely possible, but I do believe that the Vikings' end to their playoff run will probably have something to do with Sam Darnold not playing that well. And the investment in J.J. McCarthy is probably going to lead to the Vikings moving in a different direction and not signing Sam to a huge contract because they do have belief in J.J. McCarthy. That's my personal opinion, right? Then you think about the pressure that there is to compete in the AFC West. Jim Harbaugh and Herbert and what they're doing with the Chargers in a rebuild. Bo Nix and Sean Payton, Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs, right? The Raiders don't want to be that dead last team. They want to bring energy. They want to bring a little bit of oomph to the city of Vegas, right? So I think Sam Darnold is definitely talented. 14 wins this year, 35 touchdowns, only 12 picks. He had 5 game-winning drives. He was top 5 in yards and touchdowns. And the Raiders situation could definitely utilize a veteran quarterback. They've got Brock Bowers. He might be the best tight end as soon as next year in football. Jacoby Myers, the reliable third down chain moving receiver. Their O-line is young and underrated. And their defense will have Max Crosby and Christian Wilkins back next year, and probably an upgrade at head coach and upgrade at coaching staff across the board. So I could definitely see why Sam Darnold would be enticed by the Raiders. There's a lot of good players there. There's enough at the receiving core. And then if you go with Sam Darnold as your veteran option at the position, guys, that means that 6th overall pick can be used on a playmaker or a corner or something like that, right? The draft pick can be used on helping Sam Darnold, whether it be like McMillan at wide receiver, whether it be, an offensive lineman, whether it be a defensive player. There could be a lot of different ways you would go, and then you get a quarterback that can win right now. All right. So that's why I like Sam Darnold to the Raiders. Before we get to the next free agent, the chat says he's staying with the Vikings, says Caden. I could definitely see it, bro. But I think part of this is a projection of I think if the Vikings have a disappointing playoffs, it will lead to Sam Darnold leaving, because I think the Vikings are going to be willing to run with JJ because they're going to see how the season ended, especially with how Darnold played against Detroit, which may have just been a bad game. But I'm just kind of projecting, if that makes sense. The Raiders should trade for JJ. Vikings keep Darnold. That's a possibility, but JJ is not a free agent, so he can't be listed in this video. But that's also possible, especially with the fact that McCarthy was a Michigan quarterback. And if anybody's been paying attention to the Raiders, guys, I'm telling you, this Tom Brady thing is real. Tom Brady's going to have an influence. And I think he likes Sam Darnold. So I could put the pieces together right there. The second free agent, we're going to head to the defensive side of the football. Jevon Holland is one of the best in his prime secondary playmakers that will be available. And Jevon Holland has had multiple seasons in his career as a top 4 graded safety in football. The spot that I think makes the most sense is Jacksonville. First of all, he plays for the Dolphins right now, so he'd be able to stay in the same state. I think that does help a little bit. But you look at the most needy team for secondary help, they need a rangy safety that can make plays on the football, that might be able to play, zone or man, can play in a lot of different systems, in my opinion, and is a highly underrated asset to any defense. Jevon Holland would instantly help Jacksonville's biggest weakness. They were 31st in yards allowed this year, 31st in first downs, 32nd in turnovers forced, 32nd in pass defense in terms of yardage allowed. And then you think about Holland's skill set, they could use some speed, some range on the back end of their secondary. He probably won't break the bank. You think about what Jacksonville had at safety this year: Antonio Johnson, Andre Cisco, Darnell Savage. These guys were all ranked 72nd or worse by Pro Football Focus, which is absolutely disgusting. Okay? That's not even starting caliber. Savage played a little bit of nickel corner as well. I've liked Cisco, but it does appear that Cisco might be moving on. So Holland could be a player that really does jump out and go to a team that needs desperate safety help. Now, a couple alternatives that I would throw out there. Cincinnati came to mind. They could replace Jesse Bates, which they've never been able to do, with Holland in the similar skill set. Or the New York Giants are another team that have an absolutely brutal safety position. One player, a decent kid out of Minnesota, Newbin. But other than that, they need some help, right? So I think they could throw some money at their secondary as well. They gave up way too many big plays. Let's check the chat real quick. Let's go to Danny Dimes. You want the Vikings to go with Danny Dimes? Coach Laxer wants Holland to go to the boys. Luke says, yes, please. I'd love Holland on the Jags. I think Holland will probably end up going for cheaper than is deserved, in my opinion. I think probably the NFL thinks of him higher than a lot of fans. But I definitely could see, because of the injuries he sustained the last couple of years where he's missed a few games, it might bring a little bit of questions to giving him a huge contract. Yeah, the Bengals, definitely. The Giants. In terms of Sam Darnold, I didn't bring up the alternative locations. Obviously, there's Minnesota. The New York Jets, a reunion with the New York Jets, if Aaron Rodgers does not come back, I think that does make sense. I think Watson actually said something about that. Sam back to the Jets makes more sense than the Raiders, in my opinion. He would instantly be the second best quarterback in the division. That would be Drake May, actually. I'm sorry. No, actually, I think the Raiders, I think it depends on what goes on with the receiver position and all that stuff and the offensive line. Like, I think the Jets, because of this whole Aaron Rodgers fiasco, they're kind of in a little bit of a rebuild, in my opinion. So I don't necessarily think they're going to go after a veteran quarterback, but I could be wrong. And then the other team was the Giants, actually. I thought about the Giants as well if they don't get their preferred. So a return to New York is very possible for Sam Darnold, in my opinion. Okay, let's get to the next player, which is T. Higgins. Now, half the chat's going to say, Mitch, you're a jabroni. You're just biased. But hey, I mean, the Patriots have the most cap space in the NFL. The Patriots need a receiver really, 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 really bad. They have a young quarterback. They need a number one target. They've got a guy that can launch the ball down the field. That's excellent in throwing the ball in tight windows. T. Higgins makes almost too much sense for the New England Patriots. There's even been reports throughout the season, like not even like now, like in week 6, there were reports like the Patriots love T. Higgins. And then you consider New England wanted to give Calvin Ridley the bag. And T. Higgins is younger and better than Calvin Ridley, right? So imagine what they're going to throw at T. Higgins. Now, I do think that Cincinnati could reclaim him and re-sign him. But the problem is going to be, how do the Bengals possibly choose between paying Jamar Chase and fixing their defense, right? Like, the Bengals need to prioritize their defense this offseason. And yes, they have cap space, but if I'm the Bengals, I'm thinking about helping my defense out because they were atrocious. Meanwhile, New England's going to be throwing crazy amount of money at T. Higgins. Like, and plus, if you look at New England, you're like, if you're T. Higgins, you're like, well, Drake could be really good. Like, and I could be clearly the number one receiver. I haven't really been respected as that in Cincinnati because Jamar is there. And as much as I love the Bengals, like, I could get the bag with the Patriots, man. So like, and maybe there's a coach that's really like attractive. It could be Ben Johnson, right? It could be a Ben Johnson offense with T. Higgins in it as the number one receiver. Imagine that. Or it could be Mike Vrabel, a player's coach, right? That guys love to play for, right? And you think that T. Higgins, like 73 receptions this year, previous high was 74 in 14 games. He had 911 yards this season, which was the second highest yards per game of his career. He had 10 touchdowns, which was the highest of his career. He was actually 5th in PPR points per game for those fantasy players out there. So that means he was the 5th most productive receiver in football on a per game basis. That means he's an elite option when he plays. Now, he's had a little bit of issues with staying consistently healthy, 12 games this season, but I think a team is going to pay for T. Higgins because he showed this year he could go crazy in big games. The alternative locations would be the Bengals, back to the Bengals, or the Carolina Panthers. I did consider the Panthers. I believe Higgins did go to Clemson, and I do think he's from that area, so that would make sense. Also, Bryce Young, he's been a little bit better lately. Dave Canales' offense needs a big outside perimeter target like Mike Evans, when he was in Tampa Bay. So T. Higgins would make a lot of sense. Bro, I'm not taking my shirt off, guys. Relax. Herbert is so overrated, says Commander. What's up? Burns says could be the Chargers too. Luke says Chargers. Chargers, yes. I think the Chargers, the thing with the Chargers is, honestly, I don't think they prioritize receiver as much as people think because Harbaugh is not that type of coach. That's not their identity, right? They chose offensive lineman Joe Alt over Malik Neighbors, right? Just recall that. Remember that. Also, on top of that, they don't have nearly as much money as New England, or they don't have nearly as much money, I don't think, as Carolina, but I could be mistaken there. I think the Chargers would probably be more willing to maybe draft another receiver or maybe go for a lesser free agent. That's just my opinion, though. More concerned, Bengals throw the tag on Higgins. That's possible as well. I definitely think he could end up back with the Bengals. Higgins, possibly a Commander, him and Terry. Now, this video is only talking about teams not in the playoffs, okay? But receivers to the Commanders are very, very possible. I would not rule that out. Higgins to the Bolts, I like it. I like Tyreek to the Bolts. Herbert has an arm, and I want to see more of it. I think Tyreek to the Chargers would be sweet. I would love that as a fan of football. Okay, our next free agent is Trey Smith. In my opinion, the best offensive lineman available. Ronnie Stanley is also a great player. He plays tackle. Trey Smith plays guard. Trey Smith has been one of the unsung heroes of the Chiefs dynasty up front. And I think because the Chiefs are so good, it's going to be hard for them to pay Trey Smith at the amount of money that I think other teams will be willing to invest. So I think he most likely does leave. Like, I definitely think that. My choice was Chicago, but I debated the Giants, the Seahawks, the Bengals. I debated all those teams due to their need for offensive line help. But Chicago has a ton of money, and Chicago has an interesting connection. So first of all, they're likely going to hire an offensive head coach. So that definitely helps in terms of investing on the offensive line and making the offensive line big, powerful, and good, right, in front of Caleb Williams. I think that will be a priority this offseason for Ryan Poles. Then you think the Ryan Poles. Ryan Poles was in Kansas City from 2009 to 2021. The final season he was there, they drafted Trey Smith in the mid rounds, I believe. And Chicago, if they do have like a weakness in terms of an individual position on the offensive line, it would be right guard, which is where Trey Smith plays. Their current right guard was Matt Pryor, who did grade as the 21st best guard according to PFF. But Matt Pryor has pretty much been a journeyman or a backup for like 99% of his career. So I do believe they could be looking to spend and upgrade at that position and keep the middle of the pocket secure for Caleb Williams. The Chicago Bears have the 5th most cap space this offseason. And this would allow the Bears to become a more physical football team up front, to be able to protect their quarterback, who got sacked the most in the NFL this year, 68 times, but also be able to give a little bit more physicality to the Bears, run the football, take the pressure off of Caleb. Because Trey Smith is one of the best run blocking guards in football, and he's one of the most consistent guards in football. His grades through his first 4 seasons, 15th, 12th, 10th, and 10th throughout his career. So he's been a top 15 guard every season of his NFL career so far. Okay. He's also 7th in run blocking this season. So I think Trey Smith is awesome. I think he's a borderline Pro Bowl, all pro caliber player. And I think he'll be paid like that this offseason. Okay. Let's get to the chat. Do you think Garrett Wilson will request a trade? I appreciate the question. I don't know. I think a lot of that is dependent on Aaron Rodgers. I think if Aaron Rodgers comes back to the Jets for whatever reason, then I think it's more likely than not that Garrett Wilson asks to leave. But I think if Garrett Wilson has a new coach, a new quarterback, there will be reason for the Jets to appease him because Devontae Adams will be gone and Aaron Rodgers will be gone and it will be a fresh start. So I actually think it kind of depends on Aaron Rodgers. That's my opinion. Again, you guys can disagree. What do we got? Brady will be the Raiders quarterback if he can't figure one out for the team. You're probably right, Steen. You're probably right. Cincy, what's up, man? Pay Me says Aaron Rodgers is going to open a cannabis club. That sounds like a good venture in his retirement. I think that's probably likely. Pats, please, the line needs a massive overhaul, says Burns. Okay, so I thought about the Pats, bro. Obviously, think about the Pats with every free agent. I don't try to be too biased, but I will say I think New England is more comfortable with their guard position than their tackle position. I think the Patriots, if anything, they'll spend on a tackle like Ronnie Stanley, I think, rather than Trey Smith, because their tackles are atrocious. CTE says Notre Dame or Penn State. I lean Penn State, bro. I lean Penn State. Cincy life. Who do you think the Bengals are going to grab? Let's move to the next guy on the list. We gotta get going here, guys. Let's get to the next one. So number 5 is Josh Sweat. And Josh Sweat has been low-key super underrated pass rusher in the NFL lately. Last few years, not enough people talk about him and his impact on the Eagles. And I think because the Eagles are so stacked with so many young premier players, so many Pro Bowl caliber talents, Sweat is likely going to leave. And I think the best place for him would be the Cardinals. And the reason I say the Cardinals is the connection to Jonathan Gannon. Jonathan Gannon was the defensive coordinator for Josh Sweat in 2021. Okay. 2021 is important. Why? Or in 2022, I should say. 2022 is important because the Eagles went to the Super Bowl. The Eagles set like an all-time sack record, and Josh Sweat had the most sacks of his NFL career under Jonathan Gannon. He had 11 sacks that season. So there's probably a good relationship between the two, understanding that Sweat is thinking like, oh yeah, with this guy, I had 11 sacks. You know, that's good for my career. Even, you know, the Cardinals could give him a bag, and they need pass rush. I don't know how many more years the Cardinals can go without spending on a pass rusher. It's been since Chandler Jones went crazy that they've had a pass rusher. Like, it's been a minute since they've had a pass rusher, right? So this is a Jonathan Gannon guy who he knows well, who Sweat knows well. It's a good relationship. Sweat actually has been the most productive edge rusher on the Eagles this year. 21st in pressures, first in terms of edge production for Philadelphia this season. And he also is 24th in his PFF grade. He has 8 sacks this season. He's been a good player. Started a little slow, but overall has been a very good player this season for the Eagles. And I don't know. The Cardinals had 4 sacks lead their team this year, 6 sacks lead their team last year. I don't know how many more years they can do this. All right. I really don't know. So Sweat to the Cardinals makes sense. Some alternatives I thought of: Cincinnati, they need a pass rusher. They need defense. Atlanta, they need a pass rusher. They need defense. And Carolina. But I think Carolina will likely draft one, which kind of allowed me to move in a different direction with what they'll do on defense. Thank you, Luke. Appreciate that, man. Guys, what are we saying in the chat? Joseph says, do you think the Dolphins will do anything? I think the Dolphins probably will. I think the Dolphins will probably address their offensive line. I think they want to protect Tua. I think they'll probably trade Tyreek Hill, and they might bring a receiver in, you know, maybe like trade for a receiver. Maybe they'll draft a receiver. Maybe they'll sign a receiver to try to replace him. And then defensively, probably interior defensive line help. I think they're pretty good on the edge. I like their edge position quite a bit, actually. Their corners are a little old. Maybe Ramsey leaves, so maybe they draft that position. But that's kind of how I see Miami going. Why does Mitch hate us? I don't hate you guys. I love you guys. What are you talking about, bro? I love you guys. You thought Reek was staying. He might, but he might not. He's a diva. He's a diva. Does Tua have CTE? Probably. But we still cheer for him anyways. All right. Cowboys, what do you think we are doing? What do you think the Cowboys are doing? Oh boy. Does anyone know what the Cowboys are doing on a yearly basis? The offensive line, I still think, needs a little bit of help, but a lot of the pieces are young. Okay. Wide receiver 2, I think, definitely needs to be addressed. I think they might run with Rico Dowdle as their running back, but I think a complement would be nice, rather in the draft or in free agency. Dak's going to be the quarterback. Defensively, linebacker, interior D-line, and that's probably it, because I think they feel pretty good about their safeties and their corners. I think their secondary is fine. I think that Diggs just needs to play a little bit better than he did last year, which is understandable because he was hurt and Bland was hurt. So I think they'll be all right. Any right tackle upgrade for Atlanta? I think it's probably unlikely. I think they'll stick with McGarry at right tackle. All right, guys, where are we at? Let's get to the next one. This is kind of a cohesive vision for the Carolina Panthers. All right. So if you're a Carolina Panthers fan, get excited. We've got 2 remaining, and I've got both these players going to the Carolina Panthers. So the first is, in my opinion, one of the best linebackers in football this season. Very underrated name that will enter free agency, of the Philadelphia Eagles, Zack Baun. Zack Baun has been PFF's #1 graded linebacker this season. He has put up ludicrous stats this year: 3.5 sacks, 5 forced fumbles, 151 tackles, and 11 tackles for loss. He also has 8 games of 10-plus tackles. I've got Zack Baun going to the Panthers, and let me explain why I like this move. Okay. So Zack Baun is a Vic Fangio guy, obviously. This is where his breakout has begun. Could he return to Philly? It's possible, definitely, because of his success in Philly, as opposed to what happened earlier in his career where he wasn't able to break out. But I wanted to give a guy a new team for every single one of these guys because I want to be fun. I don't want to be lame. All right. So with Zack Baun, why Carolina? First of all, Carolina's GM is a linebacker. Dan Morgan was a former linebacker. So I'm pretty sure he'll value the position of linebacker. Carolina lost Frankie Louvu to the Commanders this offseason, and their defense suffered. Their pass rush suffered. Their run defense suffered. Their coverage in the middle of the field suffered. So losing Frankie Louvu, understanding the importance of what he brought, the versatility at which he brought, his ability to pass rush, his ability to blitz, his ability to defend the run, Zack Baun can do similar things. All right. So I think that the Panthers address that. They need a playmaker. They need a guy in the middle of their defense that's going to make everyone around them better, right? Their new Luke Kuechly, so to speak. He's not going to be Luke Kuechly, but you understand what I'm saying. He was also first in coverage grade, which does give Luke Kuechly vibes. Right now, they only have Josie Jewell and Wallace, the kid out of the draft, who was like a later round pick. I want to say it was a 3rd or a 4th round pick, a mid-round pick. But the current defensive coordinator for Carolina is also a Vic Fangio disciple. So the defensive transition, that's Evero. The defensive transition from Philadelphia to Carolina would also be pretty subtle and pretty easy for Zack Baun. So those connections to me make a lot of sense. Yeah, holy tackles is right. Now, the other player that I think the Carolina Panthers could definitely target, and honestly, this wasn't my first choice, okay? And I'll explain the alternative after, but Carolina probably is going to go after a receiver, whether it be through a trade or whether it be through a signing or whether it be through the draft. I think they're going to pick up a receiver. And one of my favorite receivers in the NFL for like the last 7 years has been Chris Godwin. Chris Godwin is one of my guys. I love Chris Godwin. He's such a good football player. He's a tough football player. He's a great leader on and off the field. And I think he could leave Tampa Bay. I definitely do with the state of where they're at. He definitely could. I think it's possible he returns due to the injury. He loves Tampa Bay, right? He loves that entire team, Mike Evans, all the boys, Baker. But if a team could entice him to leave, I feel like it would be Carolina, because they have Dave Canales, who was the offensive coordinator of Tampa last year. Godwin played for him, in that offense last year. I think that Carolina's a team that could use a receiver like Godwin, a veteran, middle of the field, savvy player that could complement Bryce Young's strengths of throwing the ball in the middle of the field with touch, with precision. All right. And Godwin was awesome this year, which leads me to believe even with the injury, he's still going to get paid, right? Like, he's been a very productive player throughout his entire career. He's 28. He's not 30 plus. And even with the injury, he was 11th in PPR points per game. So, a number 1 receiver, a top 12 guy in terms of fantasy football. He was leading the NFL in receptions when he got hurt. So he is a constant target machine, just an absolute reception pile up man. And that toughness is, I think, very, what's the word? It's just very influential to the rest of your team. If you bring in a player like this, the rest of your team is going to feel that vibe. It's going to feel across the board. You're going to feel a tougher presence on your team. So I think Canales understands that. I think he'll make that known to the Carolina front office. I think because of that, Carolina will give Chris Godwin a nice contract offer, which maybe entices him to leave Tampa Bay. Now, some other places that I think Chris Godwin could go. Pittsburgh was the one that I actually wanted to give. And the reason I went with Pittsburgh initially, but Pittsburgh's in the playoffs, so we don't really want to talk about Pittsburgh, but I'm still going to do it and break the rules. Pittsburgh, they're in Pennsylvania, first of all. Chris Godwin played, I think, at Penn State, if I'm not mistaken. I'm pretty sure he's from that area. So, and it'd also be very far removed from Tampa. The problem with playing for Carolina is that they're in Tampa's division. And Godwin's such a loyal soldier that I feel like it would be difficult for him to face the Bucs twice a year. So for him to go to Pittsburgh, he wouldn't really have to face the Bucs, and it would be a totally different vibe. Plus, it's a strong culture. They do need a receiver in Pittsburgh, especially a middle of the field target. Mike Tomlin's a great coach. That's, probably going to give Chris Godwin just be enticed by that, right? Like, Pittsburgh's a great franchise. So I think Godwin would definitely be intrigued by the prospect of Pittsburgh as well. I thought about the Patriots, but I do think the Patriots more so need an outside perimeter target more so than an inside player, which Godwin is more so an inside player. But man, I would love if Chris Godwin was on the Patriots. Absolutely. And the Raiders were the final one I thought of because of Tom Brady. And because they could use another receiver. I mean, they don't really have like a number one receiver. Myers is kind of like a number two, a really good number two. And Bowers is an excellent tight end, but they could use a wide receiver, especially if they want to throw money at Sam Darnold. Bringing him a receiver like Chris Godwin would make a lot of sense. I think Tom could maybe talk him into it as well. So, yeah, those are my free agent landing spots, my early free agent predictions, free agent landing spots for the 2025 NFL offseason. I appreciate everybody tuning in, all the great comments. Appreciate Cincy, CTE, Pay Me, Luke. Shout out to you guys. Fitzgerald, Dopey, Steen. Thanks, guys, for joining, man. So just to recap, we've got Sam Darnold to the Las Vegas Raiders, being the new quarterback next year. Jevon Holland to the Jacksonville Jags. T. Higgins to the New England Patriots. Trey Smith to the Chicago Bears. Zack Baun to the Carolina Panthers. Josh Sweat to the Arizona Cardinals. And Chris Godwin to the Carolina Panthers. Thanks, guys, for watching. We'll see you next time. Peace.